their lives because of guns. In fact, every day in America, on average, 34 people are murdered with a firearm, and more than 183 people are injured in an attack. But while no other country in the industrialized world would tolerate such statistics, in fact, gun deaths in most of those countries barely crack triple digits annually. In the United States, it is accepted as a grim reality. By comparison, in 2011, for example, the United Kingdom had 146 deaths due to gun violence. Denmark, 71. Portugal, 142. Japan, 30. But last year in the United States, almost 40,000. A 2016 study in the American Journal of Medicine found that compared to 22 other high-income countries, the gun-related murder rate in the United States was 25 times higher. The common factor in all of these other countries is that they have stronger gun laws. Our country, however, is awash in guns, and we have the shameful death toll to show for it. Despite the obvious need to address the scourge of gun violence, Congress for too long has done virtually nothing. But now we begin a new chapter. Today we will hear from a broad array of witnesses representing diverse perspectives on the issue of gun violence. They will help educate us on the scope of the problem, and they will inform our consideration of various legislative options so that we may at last take real action to address this crisis. As we conduct this hearing today, we are reminded that 1 year ago next week, 17 students and staff were shot to death, and 17 others were injured at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. We have with us Fred Guttenberg, who is the father of one of the students who were killed at Parkland High School, and I think we have some others from Parkland with us today, too. This horrible incident was just one in an ever-increasing series of mass shootings that have shocked the nation in recent years. But mass shootings are just one way in which the problem of gun violence is manifested in our nation. Every day, guns are used in suicides, domestic violence incidents, gang violence, and in so many other tragedies. Gun violence impacts all of our communities, rural, urban, and suburban, and no place is immune from its reach, including our homes, our streets, our schools, even our places of worship. Clearly, we must change our approach to combating gun violence. As challenging as this problem is, however, we do have the ability to address it and to make our citizens safer. What we have lacked in recent years is the political will. We should remember that the Second Amendment does not prevent the government from enacting legislation to prevent gun violence. Even Justice Scalia acknowledged in his 2008 opinion in District of Columbia versus Heller, an opinion that upheld an individual's right to possess a firearm. In his opinion for the court, he wrote, quote, "Like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited," unquote. While Congress has done almost nothing in recent years to address gun violence, citizens across the country have been organizing and demanding action. As a result, several states have strengthened their gun laws. I'm disappointed that in his lengthy State of the Union address last night, President Trump did not see fit even to mention the need to protect our citizens against gun violence. But it is evident from the energy in the crowd in this room, as well as the millions of people across the country fighting for sensible gun safety laws, that the public is demanding national legislation too. I'm particularly heartened by the mobilization of so many students and young people from diverse backgrounds and from every part of our nation who are now at the forefront of this effort. They join mothers and fathers in calling on us to do more to create a future in which children do not fear being shot in school or on the streets. We have also seen many in our medical community adding their voices to the movement, shocked at how often they must treat gunshot victims, devastated by the need to console the families of those who lost their lives to gun violence, and stunned by Congress' failure to address this problem. It is now time for Congress to begin answering these demands, and that is why we are holding this hearing today. We have a large panel of witnesses, and we wish we could have included even more people who wanted to testify, including current members of Congress who have worked very hard on this issue in recent years. Today, however, is just the beginning of our discussion of these issues, and I hope to hear from many other people as the committee continues its work on this important topic. I want to note that we have with us in the audience today several survivors of gun violence, as well as family members of those whose lives were lost to gun violence. I've already mentioned one such person. We thank you all for your courage and for attending today. Congressman Mike Thompson, Chairman of the House Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, is here as well. He has worked tirelessly to bring attention to this issue and is the author of H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Check Act, which now has 229 co-sponsors, an absolute majority of the House. For too long, Congress has ignored the epidemic of gun violence that plagues this country. After a particularly heinous mass shooting, we sometimes pause to offer a moment of silence to honor the victims. But we do not need another moment of silence. We do not need more thoughts and prayers. We need a moment of action. Today's hearing is the first step towards that goal. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses, and I now recognize the distinguished ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all who have attended today and for holding this hearing on gun violence in America. Any form of violence, with or without the use of a firearm, is a reason for concern, and it is our job to offer real solutions for families affected by criminal violence. It's good and right to reflect on the victims and their stories. What do their experiences have in common, and how can lawmakers respond to the factors fueling violent crime? America has witnessed too many events of mass violence in recent years, yet the common factors here aren't related to background checks for private sales. Thomas Reed, a former Speaker of this House, said, "One of the greatest delusions in the world is the hope that the evils of this world are to be cured by legislation." I'll take it a step further. Today, I think the greatest cruelty in the world is to tell people you will help them in their situation with legislation and then try to pass off legislation that would do nothing to fix the problems that you claim to fix. In legal terms, that's called fraud. When we understand what is going on, evidence is shown, and it was mentioned earlier. I appreciate the efforts of those who want H.R. 8 and many who have signed on. But similar gun control measures would not have prevented Columbine, San Bernardino, Charleston, or other tragedies. It actually indicates our problem today is that we're too far unmoved by the realities of violence, victimization, and murder. We're far too comfortable offering bills that constrain law-abiding citizens without protecting them from the people who mean them great harm. We're far too comfortable talking about tragedy without learning its clearest lesson. If we want to combat mass violence, we have to address the human factors actually driving it. This means acknowledging attempts to criminalize the Second Amendment do nothing to address these complex factors that turn our attention to solutions that would. One of my first acts in Congress was to ask President Obama why federal firearm prosecutions fell 35% under his administration while widespread violence continued to infect American communities. Chicago, for example, prosecuted only 25 federal firearm crimes in 2011 and then saw 506 murders in 2012. It seems clear that if we're going to be in the business of writing new laws to prevent violence, we should at minimum commit to enforcing the laws we already have. Next door to Washington, Maryland illustrates how miserably gun control fails to prevent violence. Maryland requires universal background checks, bans assault weapons, restricts magazine capacity, and permits to purchase handguns, which then must be registered. All of these things that gun control advocates have asked for. But yet Baltimore consistently ranks among the top 5 cities for gun violence nationwide. Again, I implore my colleagues across the aisle to look at our cities and our schools and to respond in a meaningful way. We best honor victims of gun violence by looking at the evidence. Neither H.R. 8 nor any of the proposed gun control measures would have prevented a single mass shooting in the last 20 years. When we point the stories of tragedy without learning from them, we exploit the victims, Mr. Chairman. In 1999, Columbine destroyed families in Colorado. In the weeks before, we knew that the shooters were psychopaths and had visually given threats, but nothing was done. Law enforcement knew. They failed to intercede. Virginia Tech, another issue where the murderer had been involuntarily committed to outpatient health facilities, but that was never uploaded into NICS, and that was not done. If it had been, he would have never been able to purchase the firearm. A month prior to the Navy Yard shootings, just up the blocks from this room, the murderer filed a police report claiming he heard voices in his head. Almost a decade before the massacre, he was arrested for shooting out the tires of a man's vehicle. He was not prosecuted for the crime. A year ago this month, students in Parkland fell victim to a shooter whom law enforcement and school counselors had recommended for mental evaluation in 2016. According to CNN, law enforcement received at least 45 calls about the shooter or his family, and among the calls was an anonymous tip that specifically said he threatened to attack the school, and another call to the FBI tip line. Significant information was never forwarded to FBI's Miami field office, and law enforcement took no action. If we let these tragedies teach us, we see that we need to focus on mental health and missed opportunities. While we're careful to understand by no means are all those who suffer from mental health illness violent, we can increase public safety by improving our approaches to mental health, our compassion and care for mental health, but we also have the opportunity to help law enforcement better respond. It is my hope that we will begin to look at this problem with a larger, more honest approach. The problems of the bill H.R. 8 are numerous, and if I was here, many of you in this audience and many of the witnesses here, my question would be to the sponsors and co-sponsors, why they would give you a bill that is written and guts itself with internally in the bill and will not work. These are the things that do affect mental health and safety. These are the areas that we need to work on. These are the things that we can continue to find common ground, at the same time not offering a palliative exercise to say, here's something that will make you feel better, but not help you in the end. With that, Mr. Chairman, I do have one unanimous consent request, and that is the statement for the record by Republican Whip Steve Scalise. And I will have to also say, Mr. Chairman, I'm very concerned that Mr. Scalise, who everyone in this room knows, was very publicly involved in a shooting last year. We offered, he wanted to come, and many times this committee has offered members the ability to testify and be a part, and then, as we have done in the past, leave. Mr. Scalise was denied that opportunity. I think that is wrong. Him having to put this into the record is something that should be addressed. It goes sort of to the hearing that we're looking at right now. We're making it sound good, but in the end, for those who come looking for answers, don't find it in H.R. 8. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Without objection, the document will be entered into the record. I want to note for the record the presence of Congresswoman Robin Kelly of Chicago, who's been a champion of gun violence legislation. And I want to note that the reason that Mr. Scalise, we didn't have a separate panel for members is because we had too many members, not just Mr. Scalise, but Mr. Thompson, Ms. Kelly, and quite a few others
Mr. Chairman,
who would have wanted to testify. And we decided, and it's a debatable decision, we decided that rather than hear from a lot of our colleagues who will have other opportunities to address this issue in Congress, we'd rather hear from the witnesses.
and Mr. Chairman, I understand, except the uniqueness of Mr. Scalise's testimony, being denied this voice is tragic for all who attend and for who have been a part of that, especially from his perspective as a lawmaker who will be voting on and working with this issue. And just because he probably disagrees with the majority should not have been a reason to keep him out.
Well, he wasn't denied because he disagrees. The majority members were also, we decided we had to have a hard and fast rule today, otherwise we would have been here all day with members. But in any event, that was the decision. I look forward to hearing from, I'll now introduce today's witnesses. Our first witness is Alea Eastman, is a senior at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. She has advocated on behalf of young people and people of color who experience gun violence. She has also testified before the U.S. Senate and has participated in a number of forums on the subject. Savannah Lindquist is a student at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, where she studies neuroscience. Savannah serves on the North American Executive Board of Students for Liberty and has publicly advocated for gun rights. She is also active in her local church and holds a number of leadership positions in student organizations at Old Dominion University. Diane Latiker is the president and founder of Kids Off the Block. In 2003, she opened up her Chicago home to youth who felt threatened by gun violence. Diane sold her own television to purchase computers to provide the young people seeking shelter in her home educational programs. People in her neighborhood fondly referred to her as Ms. Diane. In 2011, CNN named her as a top 10 hero of the year. Dr. Joseph Sakrin is an assistant professor of surgery, associate chief of the Division of Acute Care Surgery, and director of emergency general surgery at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. Dr. Sakrin spends the majority of his time taking care of injured patients and performing both emergency and elective general surgery. Dr. Sakrin completed his undergraduate degree at George Mason University, trained as a medic and firefighter at the City of Fairfax Fire and Rescue Department, and received his medical degree from Ben-Gurion University Medical School for International Health in Beersheba, Israel. Major Sabrina Tapp Harper commands the Domestic Violence Unit of the Baltimore City Sheriff's Office. She previously served for 26 years with the Baltimore Police Department, where she attained the rank of Major. At the Baltimore Police Department, Major Tapp Harper served in a variety of roles from beat cop to commander. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Criminal Justice from Coppin State University and a Master of Science degree in Applied Behavioral Science from Johns Hopkins University. It's now my pleasure to recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, so that she may introduce her constituent, Chief Art Acevedo.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and to the ranking member, thank you both and to the witnesses. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce the Chief of Police of the City of Houston, who began serving and was sworn in on November 30th, 2016. Chief Acevedo leads one of the major police departments of this nation, 5,200 sworn law enforcement officers, 1,200 civilian support personnel, with an annual general budget of $825 million in the fourth, soon to be the third largest city in the nation. The value of Chief Acevedo's policing is that he understands that it is police and community, police and people. He believes in good communication, that it's vital for a successful community, and I can assure you and attest to the fact that Chief Acevedo is not a desk chief. He steadily works to strengthen and encourage the bond between the community and its police department, whether or not it's a local parade, whether or not it's a barbecue, whether or not it's a civic meeting. On behalf of the Mayor, Sylvester Turner, he shows the face of policing, and although he has been a long-standing proponent of community policing, he has changed that terminology to relationships, and he believes in relational policing, which is a major part as well of the Major Chief's position. He wants to meet and come in contact with each citizen. That is one of the reasons why devastating cases are solved, because citizens talk to the chief. He is the first Hispanic to lead the HPD. Acevedo brings a unique understanding of concerns of diverse communities in the city of Houston. He is born in Cuba. He was 4 years old when he came to the United States. He grew up in California, attended college there, began his law enforcement career in the field as a field patrol officer in East Los Angeles with the California Highway Patrol. And he rose to the ranks. One of the best forms of ascending to chief is to know your men and women. And he has recently, right before Houston, was the chief of police in Austin. We're very delighted that he is now the president of the Major Cities Chiefs. He is involved with the International Association of Chiefs of Police. He is married and is a father of 3 children. I am very pleased to say that even as we have suffered tragedies and shootings in our community, Chief Acevedo, who's been a stand-up chief and confronted these issues and said to the community that we're with you. I do want to offer to him again, to the officers that were shot last week, a wish for a speedy recovery. Having visited them this past weekend, that is our collective wish of this committee. Mr. Chairman, I conclude by welcoming Chief Acevedo and acknowledging one of his extended constituents. Ms. Rhonda Hart is here, and she is the mother of, sadly, a young lady, her very special daughter, who was shot and killed in the Santa Fe shooting in Houston, Texas. Chief Acevedo rushed to that scene. Even though it was outside the jurisdiction of Houston, he rushed to be of help. That's the kind of chief Chief Acevedo is. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I thank the gentlelady. I'll continue with our last couple of introductions. Dr. Joyce Lee Malcolm is the Patrick Henry Professor of Constitutional Law and the Second Amendment at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School, I assume. Dr. Malcolm holds a bachelor's degree from Barnard College, in my district, and a Master's of Arts and Doctorate from Brandeis University. Robin Thomas is the Executive Director of the Giffords Law Center. She holds a bachelor's degree from Duke University and a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Miami School of Law. We welcome all of our distinguished witnesses and thank them for participating in today's hearing. Now, if you'd please rise, I will begin by swearing you in. And raise your right hands. Do you swear or affirm, under penalty of perjury, that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief? Thank you. Let the record show the witness has answered in the affirmative.
Mr. Chairman, point of parliamentary inquiry on the end.
Yes, sir.
We had a conversation on the floor last week, and I just noted you left out, so help me God.
Sorry. Do you want me to repeat the whole? I will repeat
I'd
the whole
love that.
process.
Thank you.
Please stand up again. Let me repeat this oath. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief? So help you God. Thank you. Let the record show the witness has answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there's a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes have expired. Ms. Eastman, you may begin.
Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Collins, and other members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here to share my experience and perspectives on gun violence in America. My name is Alea Eastman, a senior at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. While it is an honor to be here before you today, I am only here because of horrific events that have compelled me to be here. Next Thursday marks 1 year from the day that 17 of my fellow classmates and educators were shot and killed, 17 more injured. Like me, were fortunate enough to walk away with our lives, but we will never be free from the terror. Some will carry visible scars, but all of us were scarred emotionally for the rest of our lives. I was in my 4th period Holocaust history class, and we were presenting our projects on hate groups. I could never have imagined my group partner, Nicholas Doret, would have saved my life in moments to come. After our presentations, we began to hear loud pops. When the gunman shot into our classroom, Nicholas Doret was in front of me. The gunman's bullets killed him and Helena Ramsey. As Nicholas fell, I matched his every movement and hid underneath his lifeless body as bullets riddled my classmates. I thought I was going to die. As I laid there, I begged God to please make it fast. When the shooter moved on to another classroom, I rolled Nicholas off of me and placed his head on his arm so it wouldn't be touching the cold ground. My classmates pulled me behind a filing cabinet where I called my mom and my dad to say what I thought would be my last goodbyes. I told them how much I loved them and my brothers. I will never forget that day, what I saw, what I did, what happened to my classmates. I will never forget Nicholas Doret, who in death protected me. He saved my life. The effect of the shooting did not end on February 14th. Days later, the stress from the shooting took such a toll on my mother's body that she experienced a miscarriage. Gun violence ends thousands of lives every year. It is an epidemic that extends well beyond high-profile shootings. My family knew this long before Parkland. 15 years ago in Brooklyn, New York, my uncle Patrick Edwards was shot in the back and killed. He was just 18 with his whole life ahead of him. I ask that you give my generation the chance he never had. Minority communities bear the heaviest burden of gun violence. We know this as a fact. Weeks ago, a new report showed that the life expectancy for African Americans has been reduced by 4 years on average because of gun violence. But this report didn't show me anything I didn't already know. Gun violence is an everyday occurrence, and the vast majority of affected communities are minority. We must stop the supply of crime guns, and we must also ensure that there is comprehensive criminal justice reform to address the structural inequalities in the system. I am here to tell you a simple truth. Gun violence is such an epidemic that anyone, anywhere, at any time can be affected. Rich or poor, white or black, young or old. All Americans are at risk, and this is a side of America that none of us can or should take pride in. Since that horrific day, my classmates and I have been working tirelessly in support of sensible gun laws. I got involved with Brady Campaign's Team Enough, young people dedicated to strengthening our gun laws and engaging in communities most impacted by gun violence. I am just one of the hundreds of thousands of students that came out at the March for Our Lives demanding change. Our stories and voices must be heard on the most important issue facing our generation. We are the generation that will end gun violence. I implore you to pass legislation that will make us all safer. Today in America, anyone can go on the internet, answer an ad, or go to a gun show and buy a gun with no background check required. This makes absolutely no sense. I urge you to expand Brady background checks by voting for H.R. 8 requiring checks for virtually any gun transaction. The original Brady law passed with strong bipartisan support, and this should too. The Protection and Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, also known as PLACA, was passed by Congress 15 years ago. No other industry has this kind of protection from lawsuits, and it is time that Congress repealed this outrageous law. Extreme risk laws allow family members and law enforcement to petition a court to temporarily remove guns from people in crisis who pose danger to themselves or others. Congress should encourage more states to pass these laws. Assault weapons and high-capacity ammunition magazines belong on the battlefield, not in our communities. My classmates and I have seen firsthand how uniquely lethal these weapons are. Congress should immediately reinstitute the assault weapons ban. Congress should also close the Charleston loophole. The shooter who killed 9 people in the South Carolina church shooting was able to buy a gun because his background check wasn't completed in 3 days. Most federal checks take just minutes. Some take longer, but law enforcement needs more time to complete those checks. I also urge you to address the concerns of our Black and brown communities who are disproportionately affected by gun violence. Rather than listen to special interests, I ask you to listen to the nation's young people and the overwhelming majority of Americans who have had enough. We have had enough of gun violence in our schools, in our movie theaters, our places of worship, in nightclubs and restaurants, on our streets, and in our communities. Enough. We have all had enough. I hope you have had enough too and use the power that the people have vested in you to do what is right. Our lives depend on you. Our lives are in your hands. Thank you.
Let's go to second one. Let me just say this now. I appreciate the passion and the energy of the people here, but I must ask that you refrain from making noise or otherwise disrupting the proceedings on either side. Our witnesses and all the members of the committee on whichever side deserve that. Thank you. Ms. Lindquist.
My name is Savannah, and I'm a 24-year-old college student. I'm also a daughter, a niece, and a friend. There is part of my identity, however, that I never expected to have. I am a sexual assault survivor. In the fall of 2016, I was living my dream. I had just begun my senior year of college. I was at my dream school with my dream major. I loved my job and was just months away from graduating college. I was so excited, especially as a first-generation college student. What started out as any normal day ended up becoming a nightmare. That night, I was sexually assaulted. I will spare you the details, but it was the worst thing that's ever happened to me. I pray that none of you ever go through what I did, but I do know that this sort of thing seems like it can never happen to you. Before I was raped, I saw sexual assault as something that only happened to other people. It's no secret that sexual violence is prevalent on college campuses, but I took as many precautions as I could, and I tucked my concerns away in the far corners of my mind. But after that night, I could no longer be naive. I had to come face to face with the harsh reality that there are terrible people in this world that do terrible things. Detectives Benson and Stabler didn't swoop in to save me that night like they do on Law & Order SVU. Instead, I was left completely shattered, replaying the events of that night over and over again. Due to the trauma, I dropped out of my dream school during my senior year and moved back home to Virginia. It was the hardest decision I've ever had to make, but I knew in my heart it was what I had to do. I shut myself away from everyone, and I spent my time hiding in my childhood bedroom. I gained 100 pounds, and my hair even began to fall out due to the stress. I am a gun owner, and I was one at the time. I even began safety training and target practice when I was 10 years old. But because of so-called common sense gun control laws, I was left defenseless that night. In theory, yes, I could have broken the law and brought my firearm to college with me anyways, but I knew that that wasn't the right thing to do. I obeyed the law as a responsible gun owner, and it ended in me being raped. I am just one of countless examples of gun control benefiting assailants and making victims, like myself, sitting ducks. I'm not telling you about my sexual assault to make you feel bad. To be clear, I do not want your sympathy. What I do want, however, is for you to at least consider stories like mine when you decide to advocate for laws that create additional physical and financial barriers to the right to self-defense. I could come up here and recite the Second Amendment, as could I recite statistics all day long. I could get up here and scream about how since 1950, 97.8% of mass shootings have occurred in gun-free zones. But in this debate, few care about the statistics. It's about emotion. But that emotion is understandable. There are things in this world worth being angry about. Acts of pure evil and gross injustices of all kinds seem to surround us, and there is no doubt that we hurt as a nation. But in the midst of our emotions, no matter how valid they are, we have to remember and come back to the facts. And the facts say this: H.R. 8 has the potential to make responsible, law-abiding gun owners suddenly criminals in emergency situations that would thankfully end up as false alarms, or when transferring a firearm to one of their beloved family members like their stepchild. And with all of this, H.R. 8 wouldn't have stopped a single mass shooting in modern history. Requiring universal background checks adds yet another financial barrier to the right to self-defense, even though it's already a pricey thing to exercise Second Amendment rights. And low-income individuals are at a higher risk of being the victim of violent crime. An analysis released by the University of Pittsburgh showed lawful gun owners commit less than a fifth of all gun crimes. And finally, 3 separate 2018 studies found zero evidence that universal background checks prevent gun death. I want to show you that there are real people with real stories where being allowed to legally have their firearm could have saved them. Gun owners are a diverse group. No, we're not all Republicans, and no, we're not all in the NRA. I am neither. I am a college student willing to bare her soul to the world if it means people think twice before enacting laws that restrict the right to a reliable means of self-defense. I once heard that when you're raped, you're split in two, but this allows you to come back twice as strong, and I couldn't agree more. I refuse to live in fear. Yes, I am a rape survivor, but the 9mm that I carry on my hip allows me to stand tall, stay strong, and confidently say never again. But more than anything, I want my never again to be a catalyst for other women's never going to happen. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Latiker.
Good morning, Chairman Natler, Ranking Member Collins, members of the Judiciary Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Diane Latiker. I'm the founding executive director of Kids Off the Block, a community-based anti-violence and social justice advocacy organization founded in 2003, located on the far south side of Chicago, known as the Roseland community in the 2nd District of Illinois, represented by the Honorable Congresswoman Robin Kelly. I want to thank Congresswoman Robin Kelly for arranging this opportunity. Kids Off the Block was started in my home to provide a safe haven from the prey of gang recruitment and gun violence that youth and young adults were facing and continue to face every day when doing ordinary things in life, such as going to school. Since founding KOB, we have engaged over 3,000 children, youth, and young adults in programs that have been largely funded out of our pockets or generous donors. And with continuous sadness across the street from my home, we have built a memorial tribute to youth killed by violence. There are almost 800 stones currently, and we are over 400 behind, and there is no outrage. The promises of lives lost in Chicago to gun violence and to families who will never recover. No matter how hard I work, more stones will be added until Congress acts. I am here today to urge Congress to pass immediately meaningful gun reform legislation that I believe will begin to minimize how legally purchased guns are used illegally. On behalf of the children, youth, and families of Kids Off the Block, we recommend the following. 1, close loopholes that allow purchases of guns without a background check and reselling of legally purchased guns to underage individuals. 2, strengthen federal penalties against gun trafficking and straw purchases. The current patchwork of state laws allows guns to flow from adjacent states with relaxed gun laws into cities and states with tight gun laws. And 3, federal background checks on all gun purchases, including ammunition and sharing of guns and ammunition purchases through a national database. Quite simply, no matter how many people KOB or other organizations reach, we will not be able to put an end to gun violence in our country without Congress passing legislation that keeps guns out of the wrong hands. On a personal note, and to conclude my testimony, for the past 15 years, I have dedicated my life to taking the power of the gun out of the hands of Chicago's most vulnerable youth. I strive to reduce the traumatic effects of gun violence with the most powerful feeling I know, which is hope. I have accomplished this by providing a safe space in my own home to young people aged 10 to 24, opening my door to prevent hundreds of children I serve each year from being victimized by violence in an environment where the odds are already against them, is the least I can do to show them that their community cares. That's all I ask of you, to just care. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Saccharin.
Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Collins, and other members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to share my experience and perspectives on firearm-related injury and death in America. I'm not testifying on behalf of Johns Hopkins, but rather in my role as a trauma surgeon at Johns Hopkins Hospital, a survivor of gun violence, and a board member of the Brady campaign. I was born and raised in Fairfax, Virginia, just a stone's throw away from here. As a son of immigrants, my family was living out the American dream. And in a single instant, our lives changed. A fight broke out not far from my high school, and someone pulled out a gun and shot indiscriminately. One moment, I was a carefree 17-year-old senior, and the next collateral damage as a .38 caliber bullet was ripping through my throat and tearing into my shoulder. I spent the next month in the hospital fighting for my life. Make no mistake about it, I'm here today because of the medical professionals who treated me. The second chance inspired me to become a trauma surgeon and give other people that same second chance. As a trauma surgeon, I and my colleagues are uniquely positioned to understand and address this issue. Every day, we are the ones on the front line caring for patients who suffer injuries from bullets. We are the ones trying to stop bleeding from pulverized tissue and torn flesh. We are the ones telling families that their loved ones are never coming home. We are the ones trying to deliver data-driven solutions with inadequate research funding. And we are the ones that understand all too often that the best medical treatment from this crisis is often prevention. For many years, the debate over how we prevent firearm-related injury and death was one that members of my profession were reluctant to broach. That time has come to an end. Some of us have been told that we should stay in our lane. Well, this is our lane, and doing nothing is not an option. And if we do nothing and maintain the status quo, 1 million Americans will be shot in the next decade. Let me be clear, firearm-related injury and death in America is not only a disease, it's a true public health crisis of the United States. Every day, 109 people die from gun violence and over 240 people suffer injuries from bullet wounds. The mass shootings that we've all heard about have become too common and unfortunately capture less than 2% of the entire epidemic we face as a nation. Every day in cities like Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago, we have young black men that are killed, and their stories often go untold. We need to recognize this is a multifaceted health problem requiring a diverse group of stakeholders, including, but not limited to, healthcare professionals, public health leaders, survivors, manufacturers, academia, gun owners, and yes, the young people. We must develop a broad, multidisciplinary, multi-strategy system approach that is supported by good science and research. We have the best practices we can learn from. Look at motor vehicle crashes in the 20th century. We initially focused on the drivers. We then broadened that approach from who caused the crash to factors that led to death and injury. And we invested in research. We developed solutions like seatbelts and airbags and safer roads. And since then, we have seen fatalities per mile driven fall by 85%. This is the essence of the public health approach, a multi-sector, research-informed, evidence-based program and policies. So in response, we developed safer cars and roads, and we saved lives. The American College of Surgeons Firearm Strategy Team, a group of surgeon leaders who are firearm owners, recently published a statement describing firearm injury prevention solutions consistent with a public health approach, further underlying that as Americans, we have much more in common than we have that divides us, and there are ways to come together to prevent firearm-related injuries. Congressman Mike Thompson and Peter King introduced the Bipartisan Background Check Expansion Act, H.R. 8, on the anniversary of former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords' near-fatal injury. The bill expands Brady background checks to cover all private firearm sales, including those at gun shows or over the internet. Since the Brady law was implemented in 1994, it has blocked more than 3 million unlawful purchases. Other common sense solutions that decrease injury and death include firearm injury prevention research, implementation of extreme risk protection orders, education on safe storage to end family fire, investing in safe technology, expanding access to behavioral health services, and improving victim services. We have both the opportunity and the responsibility to comprehensively address gun violence as the true public health crisis that it is. This is not a Democrat versus a Republican issue. It's a uniquely American issue, and it's uniquely in each of your hands to help fix it. The America I'm fighting for is one where parents no longer have to fear the phone call that my parents received, that the Parkland parents received, and literally hundreds of others in communities across this country are receiving every single day. As a trauma surgeon, I have to look into the eyes of these parents, and it's nothing less than heartbreaking. So the medical community implores you, the time for action is now. There's no one solution to this complex health problem, which is why we must come together as a country to build consensus and support and develop a research-informed, data-driven approach so that we can help you, as our policymakers, ensure the public safety of Americans all across this great nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Major Tap Harper.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler and members of the House Judiciary Committee for inviting me here to testify today. My name is Sabrina Tab Harper, and I'm the commander of the Domestic Violence Unit of the Baltimore City Sheriff's Office in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm here today to talk about the dangers that weak gun laws pose on our communities, specifically for women and families who are victims of domestic violence. The data is clear. Victims of domestic violence are at an increased risk of gun violence in this country. In the United States, women are 11 times more likely to be killed with a gun than women in comparable countries. Much of this fatal violence against women is committed by intimate partners. According to the FBI, almost half of the murders of women were committed by current or former husbands or a boyfriend, 10 times as many as by a male stranger. According to the American Journal of Public Health, the presence of a firearm in a domestic violence situation increases the risk of a homicide for a woman by 500%. These numbers miss many of the murders committed by ex-boyfriends who are seldom accurately categorized and who may account for another 300 to 400 of the 1,000 intimate partner murders each year. The Violence Policy Center found that a gun was the weapon used in over half of the murders in which the weapon was known. Dr. Jacqueline Campbell's research has shown that gun access by a batterer is the single best predictor of whether a woman would be killed by him, increasing the risk of her murder by more than 5-fold. Abusers also use guns to terrorize their victims. While commanding the Domestic Violence Unit of the Baltimore City Sheriff's Office, one petitioner directed my deputies to an assault rifle that had been buried in the ground for over 10 years and was still fully operable when recovered. The respondent in this particular case was also federally prohibited from owning firearms. Domestic abusers hide weapons in any place they can. I know of deputies directed by petitioners who have recovered hidden firearms in washing machines and air conditioning units as well. In a study of over 400 women in domestic violence shelters in California, 2/3 of the women who reported a firearm in their home said their intimate partner used a gun against them, with over 70% threatening to shoot or kill her, 5% actually shooting at her. That same study found that only 1 in 20 abused women who had access to a gun reported ever having used it in self-defense against her abuser. Another study found that among California handgun purchasers, women who had purchased guns had a 50% increased risk of homicide, all of which could be attributed to homicide by an intimate partner. Having access to a gun did not make these women safer. It is worth noting that mass shootings, those shootings involving the death of 4 or more people, disproportionately affect women. In an analysis of such shootings conducted by the research arm of Everytown for Gun Safety, in at least 54% of mass shootings, the shooter murdered or injured a current or former partner or family member, and most of these shootings took place in the homes. Background checks and laws restricting domestic abusers from owning weapons appear to be effective. Another analysis of Everytown found that states with stronger gun laws, including states that require background checks on every gun sale, reported lower rates of intimate partner gun homicides of women than states with weaker gun laws. There's also evidence that state laws to strengthen firearm prohibitions against domestic abusers reduce intimate partner homicides. Law enforcement officers in this country are most often tragically killed in traffic-related incidents and domestic-related matters. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Those of us who do this important work each day need strong laws that restrict firearm access to the most dangerous, based on the best available evidence and strong enforcement of existing laws. This would include policies like closing loopholes that exempt private gun sales and gun shows from background checks, ensuring that all states have laws restricting possession and gun sales to those subject to domestic violence restraining orders and domestic violence misdemeanors, ensuring that states with such laws are removing firearms when allowed and strictly enforcing the law, and amending federal laws to include dating partners, who research indicates perpetrates a substantial portion of intimate partner homicide of women. We all have a responsibility to act on the facts supported by research data to establish legal perimeters to keep us all safe. Thank you for inviting me here today to share my views on this critically important public safety issue. I am happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Acevedo.
Good morning, Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Collins, and distinguished members of Congress, and especially Sheila Jackson-Lee, who's not only been a champion and a lion on this issue for a long time, but is actually my Congresswoman, so I live in her district.
Chief, could I just say, is there also, because she does such an eloquent job, you ought to take her everywhere for your introduction at this point.
Thank you. I think I'll try that. And obviously, Congresswoman Garcia, who we've worked with for so many years at the state level, and Mr. Correa and others that we've worked with over the years. I speak today to all of you both as the Police Chief of Houston and President of the Major City Chiefs Association, representing the largest police departments in the nation, where gun violence truly takes its greatest toll. I'm also honored to speak for the U.S. Conference of Mayors and to attach their membership resolution, which was submitted yesterday. Mayors and chiefs have formed an unprecedented alliance with others to address gun violence in our nation. On June 8th, I had the privilege to join the U.S. Conference of Mayors in Boston, along with Mayor Sylvester Turner of Houston and the President of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, President Stephen Benjamin of Columbia, South Carolina, where they unanimously adopted our position paper on gun violence and reducing gun violence. And I'd like to introduce Laura Waxman, who's here today representing the nation's mayor. Laura, if you can wave. You know, it's important to realize that firearms policy is not a zero-sum proposition. We all urge that you let common sense guide you as you pursue the development of public policies that balance the long-adopted Second Amendment rights of our fellow Americans with the need to combat the scourge of daily gun violence throughout our nation. This gun violence is arguably one of the greatest public health epidemics facing the nation everyone in this room loves and serves. Chiefs of police and sheriffs join the victims in asking you to act now to prevent one more death and bloodshed. We implore you to consider multiple steps and measures to curb the ongoing threat of gun violence. The universal background check, expanded mental health provisions, red flag legislations are measures that we know will work. The time is now to make sure that next process with the process universal and we get rid of the gaps and loopholes that defeat the purpose of which they were intended. Next week, we've invited members of Congress. I think Mr. Thompson, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee, and others will be joining the major city chiefs and the sheriffs here in Washington to have a roundtable on this issue. And if you have not been invited, I'd like to extend that invitation to all members here today. We hope again that as this debate continues, that we realize that doing nothing is not acceptable. And while we really focus, and the media focuses, on the multitudes of the almost regular mass shootings in our country that the media covers, for every one of those, sons and daughters, our children, our family members, our police officers are being shot, killed, and maimed. And I would urge Congress to do something this term. It's our time to make a difference, because our streets, our neighborhoods are truly drowning in the blood of our victims and in the tears of their loved ones. And at this moment in time, I'd like to tell the young people from Parkland, Santa Fe, and beyond, in the March for Our Lives, that the Major City Chiefs is proud to stand with you. The future belongs to you, and we are here to help you secure it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chief. Professor Malcolm.
Thank you very much for inviting me to testify here before the committee. All of us are here today with the same goal. We want to increase public safety. We want to protect the lives of the citizens of our country. The thing that divides us is how we feel that we can best achieve that aim. The Supreme Court has explained in 2 landmark cases that the framers of the Second Amendment were clear about the solution to public safety. They bequeathed to us as individuals the right to keep and bear those guns in common use for self-defense and other lawful purposes. In other words, we are to have the means to protect ourselves. And I should say about those 2 cases, one, the Heller case in Washington and the McDonald case in Chicago, that the petitioners were people who really needed to protect themselves. One of the ones in the Heller case was a woman named Shelley Parker, who lived in Washington where there was a lot of drug dealing going on. She reported this several times to the police, and the drug dealers said they knew who she was and they were going to get her. In Chicago, Otis McDonald was an African-American in his 70s. His apartment had been invaded several times, and he needed something to protect himself. So these cases were brought by people who really needed to protect themselves. Now, there's some people that argue that this right of the Second Amendment is outdated. We have police to protect us, and go on to claim that permitting law-abiding citizens to have firearms to protect themselves would make all of us less safe. Do we still need to protect ourselves? Well, first, however responsible the police are, they cannot protect all of us all of the time. And in fact, in a landmark case here in Washington, we found out that they had no responsibility to protect any individual. There was a case brought by 3 women who were assaulted in their townhouse on Capitol Hill. They called 911 repeatedly for half an hour. Nobody ever came. They sued the police in Washington, and the court dismissed their case, saying that there was a duty to provide public service to the public at large, but absent a special relationship between the police and an individual, no specific legal duty exists. In short, the police have no legal duty to protect any one of us. And I should say about the horrible Parkland massacre that the school in Parkland has now decided after a study that they are going to allow the teachers to be armed. On the hands of guns being valuable to protect themselves, the FBI does not record self-defense. So there have been some national surveys in an effort to try to find out how many people have actually used a gun in self-defense. And the national surveys, which vary a lot, have found between 700,000 and 3.6 million defensive uses of a gun annually. Normally, all that the person defending himself has to do is actually brandish the gun. They almost never need to use it. It's just a way of showing that they can protect themselves during an attack. Will the private transfers of weapons on the FBI instant background check prevent gun violence? No, they will not. On the other hand, tactics to make it difficult for law-abiding Americans to keep and carry weapons in common use for their self-defense is a serious infringement of their constitutional right. And rather than improving public safety, will make the public more vulnerable to those who would seek to harm them, including the battered women who are in danger, including students who are in a school where no one is protecting them. To conclude, Justice Scalia, in writing for the majority in the case of District of Columbia versus Heller, reminded us the enshrinement of constitutional rights necessarily takes certain policy choices off the table. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, point of information, Mr. Chairman, it's me. Mr. Chairman, it's just important. It's important before we go on. Where I'm not on important pieces of information, on declarations that are factually wrong. It's important to point them out. The Broward County School Board, the Stoneman Douglas teachers did not conclude that the response to what happened in their school is arming teachers. It's important that we get those facts straight.
There was a commission, if I could be allowed to respond. There was a commission that was set up by the school, and it decided that that was the best.
That's also incorrect. We'll look forward to the exchange.
We'll deal with this in the question period. Thank you, Professor. Ms. Thomas.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Collins, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify here today. My name is Robin Thomas, and I'm the Executive Director of the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. Giffords Law Center was formed more than 25 years ago after a mass shooting at a San Francisco law firm, and renamed for Congresswoman Gabby Giffords after joining forces in 2016 with the organization she co-founded with her husband, Captain Mark Kelly. I've been the Executive Director of the Law Center since 2006. 12 years ago, I told a committee of Congress that numerous loopholes undermine our gun laws, putting American lives at risk. Since I last testified before Congress, no significant progress has been made to close these loopholes, and more than 390,000 people have died from gun violence in our country. Some of these shootings made national headlines and shocked the nation. The massacres at a Safeway in Tucson, at Sandy Hook Elementary School, a church in Charleston, in Orlando, Las Vegas, Parkland, and Pittsburgh, just to name a few. But most American gun violence never makes the news, despite nearly 100 people dying every single day. The nominal effort made to address the reporting of records to the background check system has not done enough to stem the tide of gun violence in our country. It's still far too easy for people who want to do harm to get their hands on guns. Because federal law doesn't require a background check on every gun sale, people who shouldn't have guns are legally prohibited from accessing them, like domestic abusers, people with violent criminal records, and people prohibited for mental health reasons, can easily buy guns from unlicensed sellers with no background check and no questions asked. Even if prohibiting records are in the NICS system, people can simply bypass that system altogether. A 2013 study found that approximately 80% of all firearms acquired for criminal purposes were obtained from sources who were not required to run a background check. And 96% of inmates who were prohibited from possessing a firearm at the time they committed their crime obtained a gun this way. Congress must close this dangerous loophole. That's why I'm grateful to Congressman Mike Thompson and this committee for prioritizing H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019. H.R. 8 will make it harder for dangerous people to get their hands on guns and hurt themselves or others. Since 1994, background checks have stopped over 3 million gun sales or transfers to convicted felons and other prohibited individuals. This bill would expand the appropriate use of this system, ensuring that laws prohibiting these people from possessing guns are properly enforced. But while closing the loopholes in our federal background check system is a critical first step, we must also do more to cover people at a high risk from committing violence who are not currently prohibited from purchasing guns. This includes abusive dating partners, stalkers, and people convicted of hate crimes. We should also ensure families and law enforcement have the tools they need to intervene when someone demonstrates signs of a serious crisis, called Extreme Risk Protection Order laws. These laws create a legal process to temporarily remove firearms if a court finds someone poses a real risk. These laws now exist in some form in 13 states and save lives while ensuring due process. We must invest in our collective future. Congress should better regulate the gun industry and enact a gun trafficking law. It should also address gun violence in communities where its costs are felt most acutely, in urban areas where young African American and Latino men are most impacted. Well-funded violence intervention and prevention programs can successfully break cycles of violence and level the playing fields for safety in our communities. Congress should also invest financially into research in this public health and safety crisis. Federal research into gun violence has been virtually non-existent for 20 years. This must be addressed so we can learn more about this problem and how to effectively solve it. There is no constitutional impediment to passing life-saving gun laws. Since the founding of our country, gun rights have always coexisted with gun regulations, and the need to protect public safety has always gone hand in hand with Americans' right to own guns. The only thing standing in the way of saving lives is a lack of political will. All we need to strengthen our federal gun laws is a Congress with the courage to do so. I urge this Congress to find that courage, to show leadership on this life and death issue, and to act now. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for inviting us here to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
I thank all of the witnesses for their testimony. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. My first question is for Dr. Sakrin. Dr. Sakrin, we have heard today, and we hear repeatedly during this extended debate, that the real problem, or one real problem, is mental health, that we ought to deal better with mental health. Now, I'm sure no one objects to dealing better with mental health problems. My question is the following. As I noted in my opening statement, gun deaths in most other countries are in this double or single digits, double or triple digits, 300, 200, 100. In our country, it's 35 to 40,000 a year. Is there any evidence, number one, that mental health differences, that our people are 10,000 times more mentally ill on average than people in other industrialized countries, that this provides an explanation, and that dealing with mental health alone will go any distance towards solving this problem?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. The disparity that exists between our country and other comparable countries is dramatic, as you suggest. And even when folks factor in for the rates of mental health disease and other issues, we still exceed all those other countries by a significant proportion. So it's not that we're completely dissimilar.
Thank you. I'll ask you one other question. Firearms emergency protective orders empower family and law enforcement who recognize signs of danger to petition for a court order to temporarily remove a person's access to guns if they're likely to use them to harm themselves or others. Briefly, please, what can Congress do to ensure that every American has access to an extreme risk protection order in appropriate circumstances when someone they love is experiencing such a crisis?
Yeah, I mean, this is such an important issue because when you look at the majority of deaths from firearms, those come from suicide, 2/3. And the reality is when you look at the time that it takes from when the person decides to commit suicide till they actually make that first attempt, 50% happen within the first 10 minutes. And so being able to have,
So what can Congress do?
yeah, so being
to
able to
ensure
have extreme risk protection orders where you can empower family members and you can empower law enforcement to temporarily actually seize weapons so that they're not a harm to themselves or others, I think is critical.
Thank you. Ms. Thomas, the NRA and others have argued that enacting universal background checks would penalize law-abiding gun owners and prevent such transfers as a father giving a gun to his son. Yet the plain language of H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, is narrowly written and clearly allows for this kind of transfer. Can you walk us briefly through H.R. 8 and how it explicitly protects these kinds of common transfers?
So basically what H.R. 8 does is it takes our existing law, which prohibits this variety of individuals that we deem to be at highest risk from purchasing firearms. Now, these individuals can buy firearms easily without a background check through an unlicensed sale. This law would mean that all transfers of firearms have to take place through a gun dealer, including a background check, so that background check would apply to all individuals. There are exceptions in the law for a number of instances, including self-defense, including loans for hunting and other lawful purposes, and also for transfers within immediate family members, grandparents, parents,
So
aunts,
within
and
immediate
uncles.
family, it wouldn't be subject to this?
Excuse me?
Would not be subject to this requirement, immediate family transfer?
Exactly. There's an
Thank-
exception for immediate family members being
Thank
transferred.
you. Again, Ms. Thomas, the only federal agency with jurisdiction to regulate the gun industry has had its hands tied for decades through a combination of restrictive policy riders and a shrinking budget. Can you talk about the challenges facing the ATF in its efforts to effectively regulate the gun industry and what Congress needs to do to ensure better regulatory oversight of this agency?
Well, I think there's two main issues that you're referring to. One is the funding question and the size of ATF. The entirety of ATF is the size of the Las Vegas Police Department, so it's a rather small group of people looking to look after 55,000 gun dealers across the United States. Approximately 8% of those gun dealers were able to be even inspected last year based on the number of agents that ATF has. So better funding is an absolute necessity for federal law enforcement to be able to properly do their job. Secondarily, I think you're referring to the TART restrictions, which...
What restrictions?
The TART restrictions, which are an appropriations rider which prevent ATF from aggregating trace data and using that information to properly do their job to find the source of gun trafficking. They are also prevented from modernizing their records, which is helpful to also doing their job properly as law enforcement, as well as encouraging or forcing gun dealers to keep better track of their inventory so they can better understand the source of
We
guns.
should repeal those restrictions.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Collins. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was an interesting line of questions because it hit on some things that I want to discuss. And Ms. Thomas, since you're up, we'll just continue here. On your website, it says that your organization supports national firearms registration that includes name, address, other identifying information about the owner of a firearm, names of the manufacturer, importer, model, type of action, caliber, gauge. You get the picture. You also like to require renewals of registrations annually, including submitting to a background check. Is this correct? It's off your website.
One of the many policy solutions that we think would go a long way to helping reduce gun violence would be registration.
Okay, so that's a yes.
It is
I'm
one-
just
it
asking
is-
for yes or
It
no
is
here.
one of the many comprehensive laws that
Okay.
we think needs to be in place if we're going to make progress in reducing gun violence in
Okay.
America.
And your organization, as you've already stated, is a very active supporter of H.R. 8. But do you realize that H.R. 8 explicitly states that nothing in this act or any amendment made by this act shall be construed to authorize the establishment directly or indirectly of a national firearms registry? In fact, it goes out of its way to say it doesn't create a firearms registry. How do you square this position calling for a registry with a bill explicitly saying it doesn't?
That is absolutely what H.R. 8 says, and we firmly support everything included in H.R. 8. When we go to our website includes the most comprehensive source of analysis of every gun law in every state and at the federal level, both in existence and what is possible in a world where we might want to very comprehensively regulate guns, as they do in many other countries. So what's on our website refers to all of the possible policy options that this body and state governments can consider when they're looking at opportunities to regulate guns and reduce gun violence.
I think it's really interesting because it's been reported, even under the previous Department of Justice, the Obama administration, that there's no way to actually regulate private sales. Let's talk about what we're actually talking about here. This is private sales, okay? Not when you go to a federal licensed firearm dealer. This is private sales is what is wanted to be regulated. that needs a registry because you can't keep up with it without a registry. And this goes back to my opening statement when I said, I'm not sure which is crueler, to actually tell people who come to this hearing to say we're fixing your problem and then offer something that it doesn't fix. The question here, because it guts itself inside the bill. You also mentioned red flag laws, which I share a concern here. But the interesting thing is on the red flag, H.R. 8 itself actually prohibits, like if I was this morning to get up and I've had a bad night, let's say whatever, and I just said, I don't want to live anymore, and I'm going, H.R. 8 actually would criminalize if I went across the street to my neighbor and said, I'm having a bad day, I want to make sure I don't have anything to hurt myself or my family, and give those guns to my neighbor, it actually would criminalize that. It's not in the listed exceptions, and I know there's a lot of it, but if you read the bill, it's not there. So again, I think what we've got to do is look at what is honestly being discussed here. I'm going to switch to Chief Acevedo. Chief, it's good to see you again. We had a great time in Houston. Doing something now, and you brought that up, and I think it's an issue. You know my father's in law enforcement, and I think doing something now is a commendable thing if it actually works, if it actually fits. How can you explain what we just said, going off this last conversation, can you explain how H.R. 8 can operate effectively without a firearms registry? And do you see implementation problems in this?
Well, I think that the recommendations that H.R. 8 has in there, the legislation, will not solve, will not eliminate gun violence, but it'll certainly, I don't think anyone in this panel would say that it wouldn't prevent at least one death. And the question I would have is, passing, if that one death was your child, your mother, your father, is a little inconvenience too much to save that life? And if the answer is no, then there's nothing I can say that's going to change your mind on H.R. 8, but I believe that the legislation will save at least one life. And if it's my child who dies, I want him to know, and I want God to know, that I was here today speaking on that life.
And I think the interesting thing is how many, though, again, in a law that you passed, that you give people comfort in saying that would actually pass, can they simply say the transfer was made before this without a registry? And I think this is an interesting thing to actually explore here. We're going to explore this more when I'm sure it is marked up. I'm not questioning by any means the decision or the desire to find a solution to this. This is it. I'm still in the military. I was in Iraq. I had the trauma surgeons in Iraq. We talked about this extensively. You know, this is not an issue, but let's also look at this holistically, because every time we want to go to fix this, we go to the population that is the legal gun owners buying or selling in the legal format. We go to BOP, the Bureau of Prisons, when they put out their statistics. Most criminals do not get there, as you well know, do not get their guns from legal sources. They don't. The question is interesting, curious, because this has come up a little bit. My time is running out, but an interesting discussion here is what would be the penalty for robbing a federally licensed firearm or dealer? What should it be and how should it be enforced? Because that's becoming more and more of an issue.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The witness may answer the question.
I believe that this has to be a two-pronged approach.
Mm-hmm.
We need to take folks that would commit gun violence, steal firearms. We need to have a zero tolerance and a real tough approach on that. The other thing that we need to look at is to have these gun dealers actually have to lock their firearms every night. One of the number one targets of gang members and other criminals is pawn shops and places and gun shops where they come in and burglarize those places. So I think there's a way to do it. And I think the other thing we need to do is to have Congress actually authorize and fund studying, a comprehensive study on this matter once and for all, and let the experts come up with the policy decisions on an evidence-based, which is really interesting because you're from George Mason University, pardon me? And I'm actually in the evidence-based Hall of Fame there, so I really believe that we need to study it, we need to fund it, and lastly, we need to get ATF some help. They're a great partner, but they truly are, because of lack of funding and support of the Congress, operate with one hand behind their backs, or one arm behind their backs. We need to give them both arms.
Thank you. The time of the gentleman has expired. Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am so pleased that we're having this hearing today. You know, we've experienced an epidemic of gun violence in this country, deaths from mass shootings, suicides, and for years we have failed to have any attention, any hearings, any legislation to deal with this epidemic and this tragedy. So I am pleased that we now have the opportunity to begin work on this public health crisis. You know, it's our turn to set the agenda and to listen to the American people. So I appreciate all of the witnesses who are here, and especially the young people who are in the audience who have spoken up across the country with passion and eloquence, and it's your energy that has helped us be here today. I do have a question, Ms. Thomas, about a study that was done by Everytown for Gun Safety. They reviewed an online firearms marketplace, and according to their report, they found that almost 1 in 9 prospective gun buyers from this website would not have passed a background check. They gave one example of a customer in Georgia who was looking to buy a handgun immediately, he said within 24 hours, and a public records request showed he had multiple felony convictions, including one for child molestation. He was currently under indictment. This was someone who shouldn't have a gun. He wouldn't have passed a background check, and yet he was able to obtain it through this unlicensed seller on the internet, and that apparently is happening at a rate 7 to 1 for the users of this website. People know they can avoid the background check. What can be done to make sure that people online and looking for guns are not able to avoid a background check?
That's exactly why we need to pass H.R. 8, because the reference to private sales doesn't acknowledge that private sales now, unlicensed sellers, include online sales, include many sellers at gun shows, and include sales that are happening on the street. H.R. 8 would address this gaping loophole in our background check laws and ensure that all gun sales, including sales online, are run through a licensed gun dealer with a background check.
Thank you very much. Dr. Saccharin, in the early 1970s, Congress passed legislation spurred by a call to action surrounding a public health crisis. And shortly after Congress acted, President Richard Nixon signed the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act, which banned cigarette ads from airing on television and radio in response to evidence highlighting the causal link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. Now, gun violence in this country is a public health crisis that claims the lives of 100 Americans every day and injures hundreds more every day, resulting in a nation of gun violence survivors with the trauma that leaves them with. Gun violence in any form can have a lasting impact on individuals, not only emotionally, but also physically and financially. Now, do you agree that gun violence is a public health crisis in America, and how could we address the public health implications of gun violence similar as was done with smoking?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And that's such an important question, because one of the things that we haven't done when it comes to gun violence is treated it like a disease, treated it like the public health crisis that it is. And the tobacco analogy is great, but it's also, you can talk about obesity and so many other things. And as clinicians, we have a responsibility to be talking to our patients about, things like safe storage and other aspects. And what can we do? I think, one of the biggest gaps, and we heard about this, is the lack of funding. There's been essentially a moratorium on federal funding when it comes to firearm injury prevention research. And when you talk to, folks like Dr. Redfield, who's a CDC director, he will say, I'm happy to study it as long as Congress appropriates those dollars. So I think that's one thing that's so critical.
Thank you, and my time is just about up, but I would be remiss if I did not thank my colleague from California, Mike Thompson, for the years that he has spent leading our gun violence task force. He's here in the audience today, and thank you, Mike, for your hard work.
Thank you. Mr. Gomer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and do appreciate all the witnesses being here today. And I'm thrilled there's so much interest in this issue, because as has been said, I know everybody here wants to stop the gun violence. And as a former prosecutor and defense attorney, and a judge, felony judge for over a decade, I've tried to remember any case. I can't remember any significant case I had out of the thousands where somebody went through the process of getting a gun legally to inflict the violence. We all want to stop the gun violence. I haven't heard anybody talk about the breakdown of the home, the breakdown in moral teachings. Those certainly have had an effect. And I know one of the most quoted numbers that we often hear, and we've heard again today, is that background checks have stopped over 3 million people from getting guns that shouldn't. That's the initial stop. It's difficult to get through all of the data, but it appears the best estimate is somewhere over 96% of those 3 million end up being able to get guns. That's just the initial stop. And in fact, a good indication is 2010 numbers. And these are sometimes difficult to get the exact figures, but from 2010, we know there were 76,000 denials, and the Obama administration only found 44 that actually were committing a crime by trying to get a gun illegally. So we want to all get to the same place. Here in D.C., where they have incredibly strict gun laws, it costs $125 to privately transfer a gun. People that are law-abiding, they'll pay the $125. Criminals will not. They will not stop the transfers among criminals, and that's really where we get. In Baltimore, we've heard about, it's $250. Heck, in Illinois, apparently it's $450 to get qualified to have a concealed carry. And if H.R. 8 became law, and somebody called me or anybody and said, I'm scared to death, my former spouse or live-in or whomever has threatened me, and I think he's going to be coming sometime this week. Well, the law under H.R. 8 requires, before you can do a private transfer, before you can take them a gun to try to help them protect themselves, there has to be an imminent threat. So for someone to take a gun to somebody they love so they can protect themselves that week, they committed a crime, because you can't have an imminent threat for a week. So there are issues here. We all want to get to an end of gun violence, but I would like to ask Dr. Oh, and by the way, for victims, I mean, our heart goes out to whether it's a shooting, it's sexual assault. I mean, there were so many times that as a judge, I had to stoically do my job, but I would go back to my office with a broken heart for the victims. We know who does the real suffering, and we want to stop it. And I am thrilled that we have so many people that care so deeply. But Dr. Malcolm, in your information, you indicated in 2018, the FBI reported some 26,181,000 requests for background checks to purchase a gun. Has that increase in the number of requests led to an increase in violence?
No, it hasn't. In fact, for more than 20 years, the rate of gun homicides has gone down. It's gone up slightly the last couple of years, mostly because of these suicides. And while the number has gone up, the rate hasn't. So far more people are now allowed to conceal carry across the country, get a certificate to have a gun, but that hasn't resulted in what it was supposed to do for those people who were against it. They thought there'd be shootouts on OK Corral on every corner. People are very responsible. Law-abiding citizens are extremely responsible with that right and are using it to protect themselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Ms. Jackson Lee.
I thank the chairman. Let me likewise add my appreciation for all of the witnesses. And victims are in all of our hearts. But we are reminded that you are seeking action. Let me thank the March for Our Lives and the members who have encountered these horrific tragedies. I also want to acknowledge Chairman Thompson for the years of work. I've had the privilege of working with him, and that we've come to this point is very much attributable to his persistence. And I thank him. I thank Ms. Kelly as well, having visited her district. Ms. Latimer, as you well know, Latimer, I have been at the memorial, and I will never forget. And we owe you a great deal of gratitude. I thank you so very much. Let me, Ms. Thomas, I might not get to ask you a question, but I do want to indicate that the Giffords Center has been the mainstay of data collection. And so I want to remind everyone the numbers that we have cited have come from this great work, 100 Americans dying every day. So that means as we sit here today, there are Americans being killed by guns. I believe your statistics of 3 million people effectively being stopped through gun checks. And the universal background check bill is a bill of common sense. That's all we've asked for. I want to ask Professor Thomas, let me do this. The Second Amendment is the language in particular. Allow me just to read from the Constitution. It indicates a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A simple process of background check, and I don't have a lot of time, Professor Malcolm, I'm going to direct a question to you. What in the Second Amendment is impacted through a simple, straightforward background check? How are you stopped from getting a gun? Would you be stopped from getting a gun through a background check?
I would not be stopped, but the people who are likely to misuse a gun would not go through a background check. So the background check is really affecting those people who are law-abiding citizens for the most part, and not those people on the streets.
But the law-abiding citizens would not be blocked from getting a gun through a background check. Is that correct?
If you make the background check cumbersome enough, like this new bill will, then I think it will.
You've not answered the question. You've not answered the question. The question is, what in the Second Amendment is infringed upon by a background check? We're not asking about the process and cumbersome. That has to be tested. This is a bill that indicates universal background check.
The process does interfere with people being able to get it. We've heard that there are expenses.
But we have no data to prove that. And so I think you're not connecting it. I would like to hear you say just the existence of a universal background check, not process, would violate the Second Amendment. Is that a yes or no?
Background check is a process, really, and you can make it cumbersome.
Does it violate the Second Amendment? Does it stop people from getting guns? It's not the point of who will not go through the process, is will it stop people from getting guns that you say are law-abiding citizens?
One of the members on the one of the Republican members of your committee has pointed out that there are expenses in the states that have universal background checks.
I don't think you're answering the question.
Cannot afford.
Let me go to Chief Acevedo.
So it does.
I thank you very much, Professor. I don't think you're asking the question. It does not infringe upon the Second Amendment. Chief Acevedo and Dr. Saccharin, two questions, and I really want to question all the witnesses, but let me be very clear. Chief Acevedo, you're on the streets with your law enforcement. You believe in relational policing. How much guns impacting your officers, but also, as you walk the beat, impacting neighborhoods and mothers and fathers and children? That's my question to you, and I just want to get the question in for Dr. Saccharin. Dr. Saccharin, years ago I introduced a bill where the chief of surgeon from Texas trauma from Texas Children's Hospital said at that time it cost them $67,000 to treat a gun victim, a child that was 20 years plus ago. Would you be able to answer monetarily, just maybe not specifically, but the depth of cost, both in human tragedy, but dollars that we lose by not responding to gun violence in America? Chief, would you answer the question, please? And I ask the indulgence of the chair. Yes, Chief.
Thank you for the question. The gun violence impacts all big cities across the country and suburban America as well. And if you think about domestic violence, in the city of Houston last year, we had tragically 279 homicides. It went up by 10. And the driver, the greatest driver, 38% increase in domestic violence homicides, domestic violence murders, where we don't have enough tools across our country for police officers in those situations to temporarily remove firearms, to keep women safe and families safe and children safe. And so it is a significant problem. I think all you have to do is turn on your television, listen to the radio, listen to the scanners, and go to our emergency rooms, and you'll see that it's a significant problem.
Dr. Zachary?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, because if
Time of the member has expired, and the witness was permitted to answer after the time of the member had expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. No, Chief Acevedo spoke after the time had expired. Our next witness, questioner is Mr. Getz. Oh, before Mr. Getz, I want to announce that the committee will recess at 12:30 for 1/2 hour for lunch. We will resume at 1 o'clock, and we will continue until there will be votes, which we expect on the floor sometime after 2, and if necessary, we'll reconvene right after those votes. Mr. Getz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ronald Silva was standing with a friend in his driveway when he was shot and killed by an illegal alien who had been previously deported. Agnes Gibney, who was De Silva's mother, said, "The guy who killed my son has a determinate sentence in prison, but I have a lifetime sentence of grief and pain." Alapomar Alamontario is an illegal alien from Mexico. He murdered Grant Rohnbach with a gun on January 22nd, 2015 in Mesa, Arizona. ICE was working to determine whether or not he should be deported when he had the opportunity to commit this crime. Gustavo Garcia, a 36-year-old illegal alien, shot and killed a 51-year-old Rocky Paul Jones on December 17th at a gas station. Garcia had previously been deported by ICE. Before his deportation, he had a criminal record going all the way back to 2002, where he had illegally possessed a firearm. In addition to murdering Jones, Garcia also shot a farm worker in the chest who was picking fruit, committed armed robbery, and shot and attempted to kill a woman after he followed her to a Motel 6. On January 2nd, 2019, an illegal alien shot and murdered California officer Ranil Singh, a story that captivated the attention of the country. On November 13, 2018, an illegal alien shot and killed 3 people in Missouri after he was released on domestic violence charges. This was Luis Perez, age 23, was a recipient of the DACA program in 2012 and 2014. So time and again, Mr. Chairman, we see circumstances where people illegally come into the possession of firearms. Each of these illegal aliens did not acquire these guns lawfully. Matter of fact, Title 18 of the Federal Code says that it is always unlawful for an illegal alien to have a firearm. And so while I appreciate folks from my state of Florida coming and sharing their advice and their counsel to the Judiciary Committee, I think that the stories of other people who have been impacted by gun violence are relevant to our discourse because they speak to the fact that there are dangerous people who do illegal things who will have access to firearms. The question is, what will ensure that that does not cause the massive amount of violence that we've seen in the country? And so I'm encouraged by elements of legislation passed in my home state of Florida that focus on red flag circumstances, mental health, that look at people who go through our jails and do everything we can to ensure that when their time in incarceration is concluded, they don't go back to arsenals where they can do harm to themselves or others. But as I review H.R. 8, it seems to me that there's nothing in the bill that would have stopped many of the instances that we've been discussing. And moreover, if we're really looking for solutions, maybe we ought to allow states to do what Florida did and analyze the impacts on our mental health system, recognizing that those systems are different across the 50 states. And so I hope that we will not adopt this federalization of deprivation of constitutional rights. I hope that we will allow our states to continue to innovate and find ways to keep communities safer. And as we hear the stories and circumstances for those here, I hope we do not forget the pain and anguish and sense of loss felt by those all over the country who have been the victims of violence at the hands of illegal aliens. H.R. 8 would not have stopped many of the circumstances I raised, but a wall, a barrier on the southern border may have, and that's what we're fighting for.
Mr. Chairman.
Well,
Gentlemen will suspend. Everyone here is here as a guest of the committee, and no matter what you think of what any member of the committee may say, or any witness for that matter, you must not comment or otherwise demonstrate.
Mr. Chairman, may I have my time restored?
Your time will be restored.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And so again, I think that was a rather instructive moment for the committee, Mr. Chairman, because as we gather here in Washington, there are a divergent series of views and inputs and thoughts, and my concern is that by adopting H.R. 8, we actually stifle the innovation that could lead to better public safety outcomes if we allowed states and local communities to deal with the challenges my great state of Florida has. And so again, I hope that we'll deal with all of the drivers of violence. The greatest driver of violence in the circumstances that I indicated was not the firearm. It was the fact that we have an immigration system that allows people to come here violently. We engage in...
There will be no comments or demonstrations, please.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Who's it?
Is there
Gentleman
any
from Rhode Island.
committee rule or a point of parliamentary inquiry, is there any committee rule that prevents a member of Congress from reciting false statements in a committee hearing that are unsupported by the evidence, or are members of Congress entitled to just make things up in support of specious arguments? It's a parliamentary inquiry.
I'm not aware, off the top of my head, since I haven't researched this question, I'm not aware of any such rule. I would also observe that the factuality of any statement is always subject to contest by someone who disagrees with it. At a hearing such as this, if a member makes a statement that is not borne out by the facts, it's the prerogative of another member, when his turn comes, to comment on that or to point out his opinion or her opinion as to its truth or falsity.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, my colleague, Mr. Chairman, no.
I believe I still control the time.
Mr. Chairman.
One moment. It is never permissible for members of the audience to comment or vociferously to object. This is a hearing for members of Congress and for the witnesses. Everyone else is here as an observer and must not participate in any way other than by observing.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from...
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order against the gentleman from Rhode Island. I make a point of order that the gentleman's words were unparliamentary because they implied the lying or the falsehood of a member. Now, if he wants to go there, then we'll take words down.
I would rule the gentleman's point of order not well taken because although because there was not an accusation...
Did he not?
Excuse me, let me finish. There was not an accusation of falsity by another member. There was simply an inquiry as to rules regarding that subject.
Did he not make the statement that he was asking that the member was making, or how to stop a member from making false statements? Did he or did he not?
My recollection, we could have it read back, but I don't think that's necessary, is that he simply asked about the rules that we use when if a member makes a false statement, which is an inquiry. It is not a direct accusation that a member made a false statement.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll just recommend that line got so far up that there was no way to see if it was crossed. He got